In the year 1889, the town of Coyote Bluffs slouched between wine-chiseled hills and an endless vault of sky, where wooden storefronts leaned like tired old men and horses knew more secrets than the men who rode them. Mark Dawson was just 23, a cowboy by trade but more often just a hungry soul chasing cattle and the ghosts of memory. He worked from sunup to sundown, taking whatever ranch job would pay enough to keep his boots on and his stomach from turning inside out. He branded calves, patched fences, broke wild mustangs, and at night he curled up in hay piles behind Carson's livery, his bedroll thin, his dreams thinner. His father, Nathaniel Dawson, once owned a stretch of land just north of the bluff. Folks used to say the man had vision-built fences before he owned cattle, sunk money into water pumps, borrowed against the future like he could see it clear. But then came the storm of '87, wild and merciless. Half the herd was lost. The land followed, and so did he. Mark dug his father's grave with his bare hands and buried him beneath a lone cottonwood tree, the same one they used to rest under. In better days, after that, the debts came marching in like armed men banknotes, sour-faced ranch hands wanting back pay, poker tabs with men who didn't forgive. Now Mark chased wages like leaves on the vine, just enough to keep moving, never enough to stay. But he didn't complain. Cowboys didn't, not out loud. One evening, while securing a busted gate over at Garrison Creek Ranch, a lone rider appeared. Dark horse, dust-covered coat, black gloves, silent. He said nothing, just handed Mark a sealed envelope and rode off without turning his head. The envelope was thick cream, edges embossed, and it carried a strange scent, lavender and gun oil, clinging like perfume over gunpowder. Inside was a folded note, written in a hand finer than any he'd ever seen. Mr. Dawson, supper, Blackthorn, range tonight. Come clean, come quiet. No signature, but the name Blackthorn was familiar enough. Eleanor Blackthorn, cattle Baroness, widow, a woman with land vast as a country and a reputation meaner than a drought. Folks said she hadn't stepped foot in town for 5 years. Mark stared at the note long and hard. He didn't own a clean shirt, but he could borrow one. He didn't know what she wanted, but he knew life never handed men like him anything that didn't cost blood. So he packed his knife, tied down his hat, and turned west toward the largest ranch in Coyote County, and a supper that would carve his life in two. The sun was bleeding into the land when Mark rode up to the gates of Blackthorn Range. His horse, tired and caked in sweat, moved like it was half asleep. Mark had borrowed a white shirt from an old friend, the sleeves too short, the collar too tight. His boots were spit-shined, his hair combed back for the first time in weeks. He felt like a colthood bronc trying to pass as a stallion. The gates loomed tall and black, iron forged into the shape of twisting thorns. At the center sat a crest-coiled rattlesnake beneath a letter B, the mark of the Baroness. A ranch hand met him at the entrance. Big man, wordless, wore his holster like it grew from his hip. She's waitin', he said, and that was all. The main house sat atop a low ridge like a monument, trap-round porch, pillars thick as trees, and a wide front door carved with roses and rifles. Inside, the air was cooler than expected. Marble floors stretched under his boots, chandeliers flickered in gaslight overhead. The walls were lined with paintings, stallions in storms, and men in gray uniforms with dead, watchful eyes. Servants moved like ghosts, silent, polished, mechanical. Not one looked him in the face. Then the doors opened. The dining hall was long and dim, lit by fire and candle. At the far end of the table, she sat already waiting, Eleanor Blackthorn, wrapped in a deep purple riding dress with silver buttons, her hair pinned beneath a lace veil. Rings sparkled on every other finger, her skin pale, her expression unreadable. A statue carved from ice and will. Mr. Dawson, she said without rising. You came. Wasn't sure I had a choice, ma'am, Mark answered, low and cautious, his head held in hand. You always have a choice, she replied. You just don't always like what happens when you say no. He sat slowly. The silverware glinted like knives, roast venison steamed on porcelain platters. A bottle of wine so dark it looked black in the candlelight stood between them. She didn't offer him a glass. Do you know who I am, Mr. Dawson? She asked, her voice even and unhurried. hands folded like she was reciting scripture. "I know what folks say," he said carefully, "that you're rich, mean, and more dangerous than a dry summer." A flicker of something not quite amusement touched her lips. "Good. Saves time." She poured herself wine, let the silence stretch, then said it like she was ordering. "Coffee. I brought you here because I need a husband, and you need something too." Mark blinked. "Beg your pardon. Marriage, legal, immediate, 1 week. Then we part ways." Quietly, cleanly. He stared at her like she'd just asked him to lasso a thunderstorm. "Why me?" "Because you're poor, decent, and forgettable." He let out a slow breath. "I don't know if I should be flattered or insulted." "Try both," she said, sipping her wine. "Say yes, and you'll never owe another man $1 in your life. Say no, and my cook will send you home with leftovers and a broken opportunity." Mark didn't touch his fork. His heart was hammering. He wasn't a man who rushed decisions. But there was something in her voice like a pistol cocked under the table that told him this wasn't just about marriage. She was hiding something, and she wanted him close enough to find it. He reached for the wine, poured half a glass, and said, "You got yourself a cowboy." She didn't smile, just nodded once, and in that moment, the world tilted. They were married at dawn. No bells, no flowers, no crowd, just a half-drunk preacher from town, a few grim ranch hands standing like gravestones, and the creak of saddle leather in the wind. Eleanor wore a black dress, veil thick over her eyes. Mark wore the same shirt he'd buried his father in, cleaned and pressed as best he could. "Do you take this woman?" the preacher asked. Mark looked at Eleanor. Her face was stone, her eyes sharp as barbed wire. He wasn't marrying a woman. He was tying himself to a storm. "I do," he said, and it felt like jumping off a cliff. "And do you take this man?" the preacher asked. "I suppose I must," Eleanor answered, flat and final. No kiss, no applause, just his signatures, a dry handshake, and the slow march of boots across packed earth. The house at Blackthorn was like stepping into another life. Servants moved with surgical precision. Meals arrived hot, exactly on time. Horses were brushed until their coats gleamed like satin. No one spoke unless spoken to. Mark was given a room with silk sheets and a window view of the canyon. He hadn't seen a real bed since the year his father died, but sleep didn't come. Easy. Each morning, breakfast appeared: eggs, bacon, fresh cornbread. Eleanor never joined him. Each afternoon, he rode the fences, met the hens, walked the land. They called him Mr. Dawson now, but not with warmth, with caution, like they weren't sure what he was or why he was here. And each night Eleanor sat alone on the front veranda with a glass of wine and a stack of old letters. Mark watched her from the hallway, always the same ritual: drink, read, sigh, vanish into the locked room at the end of the hall. Once, he asked, "What's behind that door?" She looked at him, eyes hard and distant. "The part of me that still matters." He never asked again. The days rolled by like slow cattle. Mark worked, watched, waited. He was a husband on paper, a guest in truth, and a ghost by nightfall. But on the third night, something changed. A letter slid under his door. No name, no seal, just a single line in perfect ink. "You have 6 days left to know who she really is." He stared at the paper long after the candle burned low. By the 4th day, Mark Dawson knew the truth he feared most. He wasn't the one watching the house. The house was watching him. Every door had its own creak, like a whispering mouth. The maids huddled in corners, their hushed voices snapping shut the moment he passed. The ranch hands avoided his eyes. Even the horses pulled back when he approached the stables, as if they knew something he didn't. But it was that one door at the end of the hall, the one with the iron handle, and the key Eleanor always kept closed, that kept him awake long into the night. He tried not to think about it, poured himself into the work, rode the fence lines, repaired a busted water pump, checked the edges of the property. But wherever he went, the men looked at him like they pitied him, or like they were waiting. Old Amos, the stable master, was the only one who finally said it plain: "You best keep one eye open, son." Last man who asked too many questions sleeps under a patch of roses behind the barn. Mark tried to laugh, but the sound came out thin and crooked. That night, he couldn't sleep. The walls pressed in with a kind of silence that felt too perfect, too rehearsed. By lamplight, he walked the halls like a man slipping through another man's dream. On a quiet impulse, he ducked into the study. There on Eleanor's desk sat a leather-bound journal, its pages fanned open like a mouth mid-confession. He shouldn't have read it, but he did. Page after page filled with delicate cursive names, dates, places, thoughts wrapped in ribbons of memory. One entry made his hands tremble. I was never meant to be loved again, only remembered. Another J if you're reading this. I gave him the deal. He said yes. That means I have 7 days left. The journal snapped shut in his hands as footsteps echoed down the hallway. He barely made it back to his room before Eleanor's shadow crossed beneath the door. In the mirror, he didn't see a cowboy, not even a husband. He saw a man standing inside a story that was bigger than him, heavier than he could carry. He whispered to no one, "What the hell did I marry into?" The 7th day arrived like a held breath. The air was still hot and heavy. Even the birds were quiet. Mark woke to find Eleanor gone. Her side of the bed was untouched. A half-full wine glass sat on the porch rail. No sign of the staff. No horses saddled. Just silence. And the door, the one at the end of the hall, was open. He stepped inside. The room was shrouded in shadow, and the scent of dust. Velvet curtains hung still. Dusty chairs lined the walls like waiting mourners. Above the cold fireplace was a large oil painting Eleanor, younger, smiling beside a man with fire in his eyes. Beneath it sat a trunk, its lid yawning open. Inside were letters tied with old twine, a wedding ring tucked into a black velvet pouch, and a single photograph cracked at the corner of Eleanor holding a child. Next to it, folded neatly, was a will, signed, stamped, sealed, the entire estate. Every acre, every coin, every horse left in Mark's name, on top. A final letter addressed simply, "To my husband." His hands shook as he unfolded it. "Mark, if you're reading this, then I've left, not far, just enough to make it easier for you. I didn't need a man. I needed a witness, someone honest, someone poor enough to still believe in truth. I'm not just dying, Mark. I'm disappearing, and I needed to leave behind something that couldn't be bought. They'll say I married for show, that I lost my mind. Let them talk. But you know better now. Come find me, if your heart's still clean." He saddled his horse Dusty and rode hard into the canyons, past the fences she'd once pointed to, past the flowers she admired from the porch. He rode where the land bowed in on itself, where the sky knelt low enough to touch. And there she was, beneath the old willow tree, sitting with her back against the trunk. Her dress was faded blue, her skin pale, her breath thin, a single yellow flower rested in her lap. When she looked up, her smile broke something open inside him. "You made it," she said softly. "Course I did," Mark whispered, dismounting. "You owe me answers." "No, cowboy," she breathed, her voice as soft as dusk. "I owe you peace." And with her final breath, she gave it. The wind swept gently across the canyon. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried out to no one in particular. 3 weeks later, the hills of Coyote Bluffs fell quieter than they'd ever been. Mark Dawson buried her beneath that willow, just as she'd asked. No sermon, no flowers, no crowd, just the wind, the sun, and a cowboy who now understood that love doesn't always look the way it's supposed to. The town had its theories. Some said he tricked her. Others whispered she'd been mad, cursed, haunted, that she left him a kingdom of dust too big for one man to tame. But Mark didn't care. He rode the fences every morning, boots heavy with purpose. He cleaned her study himself, read every journal she'd left, every letter she'd written and never sent. The ranch changed, little by little. The hands were paid double. The maids got rest days. He fixed up the old bunkhouse and opened it to the orphan boys from the rail camps. Then, in the center of town, he built the schoolhouse small, red brick with white shutters, and a bell that rang at 7 a.m. sharp above the front door. Carved in clean iron were 6 words, the Eleanor Blackthorn School for Frontier Youth. Mark taught the first class himself. He wrote the lessons by candlelight, taught them numbers, history, and how to ride with dignity. And sometimes when the day was done and the town asleep, he'd ride out alone to the canyon, sit by her grave, and speak like she was still listening. "I still don't understand all of it," he'd murmur. "But I reckon that's all right. You gave me more than I ever thought I'd have." As the sun slid low behind the distant hills and the wind whispered through the long grass, Mark Dawson Cowboy, husband, would tip his hat to the past. Not to mourn it, but to honor it. The Blackthorn name lived on, not in cattle, not in gold, but in children's laughter and in quiet truths, passed gently from one dusty soul to another.